The Dryad and the Hired Boy by Ethel Eliot. Chapter 1. Lark's Nest. Claire Fay had worked as hard as her brother and sister to get up a tea party for the unexpected afternoon callers, but now that the cheese dreams had been passed twice and all the green goblets refilled with lemonade, her interest in the affair failed. Nobody was speaking to her or looking at her, for, after all, she was the youngest person present, and retiring even for the youngest. So she leaned a shoulder against the jamb of the door into the hall and stood by herself, thinking her own thoughts. But Rosanna, who had her own way of knowing about Claire's thoughts, even when Claire was keeping them her own, had not forgotten her. She looked up from her place behind the tea table and called across the babel, "Don't you think the hired boy might like some dreams? There's a pitcher of lemonade still on the ice. Why don't you get him?" Claire came to attention and gave her sister a grateful glance, which meant, "You're angelic." Then she fled. But she paused in her flight for an instant under the clothes reel in the backyard. Lark's Nest, their cottage, overrun with tea-hour visitors, was dropped behind, and Claire was hovering on the edge of a sea of long grass, a hiding place for red and white clovers. But devil's paintbrush, daisies, and belated long-legged buttercups couldn't exactly hide. They all blew away together in a white, red, orange-yellow splatter up toward the patch of brown earth which topped the waves of the green sea. The brown patch was Lark's Nest vegetable garden, and at one side of it rose the barn garage, which housed their Ford, Pegaway, and Pat, the new hired boy. Claire's light lavender dress blew with the devil's paintbrush, daisies, and buttercups toward the brown patch, and her curls blew that way too. But when she started to run, the dress and the curls blew the other way, back from her, in defiance of the June breeze. The sunny grass, the hidden clovers, the racing shine of buttercups gave Claire a thrill she could not understand, but it was an old thrill. The backyard often made her feel this way in June. There was a promise of something coming in it, something mysterious and thrilling already on its way to Lark's Nest, but it would not be the kind of adventure you could put your finger on and say, "That was it." No, never. It would be quite another sort. Absorbed in this feeling and trying to drive her mind to the bottom of it, somehow she reached the vegetable garden before she thought to notice that Pat was not there. She had taken it for granted that he would be weeding the lettuce bed, as Rosanna had suggested his doing. He ought to be almost done with it by now, for he had had an hour or more, but there it lay, hardly a beginning made, and Pat was nowhere. Claire called up to the window of the barn garage, "Pat, oh Pat." But there was no answer. Where was the boy? Anyway, he must be somewhere not far. He wouldn't have gone to the village or for a walk or anything like that, would he? This, the first day of his job at Lark's Nest. Yesterday hadn't counted. It had all gone in their working together getting a cot bed up into the gabled room at the top of the barn, cleaning down the cobwebs of years, scouring the floor. But today it was understood that the boy's job began, the job of hired man. He had given himself his own title, and seemed proud of the sound of it, but among themselves the Fays changed it to hired boy, for he looked scarcely older than Claire, herself 15. He was a mystery, and of course they liked that. Night before last he had come from nowhere asking for work. He was standing at the back door about 9 o'clock, when Hester went to put the milk bottles out, the last thing before going up to bed. He spoke in a low voice, with great courtesy, asking whether it would be possible for him to see the house mistress. Hester went for Rosanna, but Rob and Claire, naturally curious as to what the boy wanted, accompanied their sister into the kitchen. Pat's face showed surprise when he saw them all three, and he looked beyond them for the house mistress. He did not guess that it was Rosanna, for although she was over 20, she had a way, especially at night, when she began to be sleepy, of looking quite far down in her teens. But Hester set Pat right. "It's her," she said. "She's the boss. Out with it now. What do you want?" Pat bowed ceremoniously to Rosanna, then bowed from his hips in an old-fashioned way that had something foreign in it, and asked for the job of hired man. Didn't the farm need one? Rosanna replied that Lark's Nest was not a farm, just a summer cottage, but yes, they did need a hired man. Hester stared her amazement, and even Claire and Rob were taken by surprise. Weren't Rob and Claire and Rosanna herself, if it came to that, hired men enough about such a little place? Didn't they themselves wash Pegaway, scythe down the backyard, and work in the garden? Weren't they proud of their independence about these things? And here was Rosanna calmly saying, "Yes, we could do with a hired man. Have you any experience?" Pat dropped his eyes from hers at the direct question, hesitated an instant, and then said, rather breathlessly, "None, but I can learn, and I am strong." Rosanna regarded him. They all regarded him, and he regarded them. But it was 4 against 1, and again his eyes dropped. He was dressed in a gray Norfolk suit and a blue linen shirt, with the collar open in a V at the neck. He had no hat with him visibly, but in one hand he swung an odd little bundle which supposedly contained his possessions. To Rosanna's few questions he answered that he had no place to sleep that night, unless he slept at Lark's Nest, that he had come a very long way, longer than they would believe, if he told them, that the only information he could possibly give them about himself was that his name was Pat Donovan, and that he must find work here at Lark's Nest, rest now or move on till he did find it. Pat Donovan. You couldn't say that he did not look Irish, with his grey eyes and square chin, but his accent, that was not Irish. It was just a shade of an accent, a mere hint. It wasn't French, it wasn't German, it wasn't Italian. What was it? They didn't know. Anyway, Rosanna hired him, and they had done their best to make him look like a hired boy by covering his remarkably good-looking clothes with a pair of Rob's denim overalls. That was night before last, and this was today, and for the minute Pat seemed to have vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Claire hoped not. She called again, and kept on calling. She was startled, though, when Pat answered, not from the barn window, but from somewhere up in the air nearer at hand. She looked for the voice, and there was Pat's head appearing above the high cement wall which divided Lark's Nest and its surrounding fields and meadows and orchards from the big estate next door, which the Fays called Tanglewood, but which named itself Wing Gate. So Pat had dared to go over there, into that forbidden country, bristling with placards lettered, "Private," and "Beware of dogs," and "Under penalty of law," and so on forever. An endless variety of threats to trespassers. Out of respect to the signs, perhaps, his voice was hushed. Secretive. That was why she hadn't caught it sooner. Now he had got a leg over the top. "All right. I am here. Only wait, please," with the reassuring, if somewhat nervous-sounding words. He jumped directly down into some green lettuce, babies. Claire winced, but Pat was too absorbed in his own affairs, apparently, to notice. The harm was done, so why mention it? Claire tore her attention from the poor lettuce and told Pat about the cheese dreams and the iced lemonade. "It makes a glorious combination," she added. Pat looked a little dazed by the word glorious being used in such a connection, but he was interested in the facts. He's a funny, hired boy to bother so about an adjective, Claire thought, while aloud she said, "I'll stay with you on the back porch, if you like, and we'll have a party of our own. Nobody cares about my being in there, and I'd much rather be with you." "That would be charming," the hired boy replied, and looked sincere in spite of his phraseology. "But these weeds, I've hardly made a beginning. In fact, I'm afraid I took an hour or so off, but I do appreciate your offering to leave your party for me, Claire." Claire's face fell. She was disappointed. "I'd stay here and help you with the weeds, and then we could have our party just the same," she said. "But this dress, Rosanna'd have a fit. She made me put it on, too, and with it I'm no good to anybody. Aren't afternoon teas a bother?" Pat was on his knees, working hard to make up for lost time. He answered between his tugs at the weeds, "I agree. I myself would rather have a glass of iced lemonade on the back steps with you, Claire, than go to the most sumptuous tea party ever given. I should think Miss Rosanna would too. She doesn't seem the sort to give many tea parties for the pleasure of it." His ideas of Rosanna, of course, had been gained yesterday, as she had appeared then, in sky-blue smock and old corduroy skirt, her buttercup hair tucked behind her ears, working away with hose and broom and sudsy hot water, and whistling all the while better than even Rob could whistle, to say nothing of Pat. Claire sank down on her knees in the grass, prepared to stay for a few minutes anyway. "Well, you don't really know Rosanna, you see," she enlightened Pat. "She's got lots of sides. She does like parties. At least, she's sociable. Very. And she dotes on making people feel at home and happy to come. And anyway, even if she didn't like it today, she would be nice, for these people are all friends of hers or mother's and father's. They're 2 autos full, and they've driven over from Crescent Lake. That's 7 miles away up the valley. There's an inn there and some quiet grand estates. Have you been there?" But Pat shied away from the direct question. Quickly he asked one. "You've a mother and a father, really?" Claire laughed. "But of course, why not? I thought you hadn't. I thought you were independent, you 3, and that Miss Rosanna was your sort of mother." "No, we've a father and a mother too. Regular ones. It's only summers when Rosanna is our sort of mother. Mother and father usually go abroad. They are painters. Gerald Fay, Beatrice Fay. Now you know." But Pat didn't, and Claire was disappointed that he had missed the fame of her really and truly rather famous parents. "Lark's Nest is our very own, though," she told him. "Not mother's and father's. We can do anything we like with it. Our grandmother used to spend her summers here, but she gave it to us when she died. Ever since we've come by ourselves at the end of June, and we usually stay till school opens. After all, if he was to be with them this summer, Pat ought to take some interest in their affairs. Rosanna was 17 that first summer, and quite grown up enough to take charge. She's 20 now. Rob's 16. I'm 15. How old are you, Pat?" "I'm 16. I thought Rosanna was about my age the night I came. I thought it was so queer for a girl like that to be a mistress of a household. A lady is usually married before she attains such a position. Or is that not true in America?" Claire picked up her ears. "Who wouldn't? So you have come from very far away, just as you said," she cried, deeply interested. "You are a foreigner." But Pat's face had lost its sparkle and sobered. He was annoyed with himself, and saddened too, Claire could see. He pretended not to have heard her direct question, and became completely absorbed in his weeding. So he did not mean to answer her at all. For an instant, but only for a very flashing instant, Claire was incensed with Pat. Here she was only too willing and eager to tell him all about herself and her family, but when it came to a return of confidences, he gave out exactly nothing, unless through sheer carelessness as the telltale question. Or is that not true in America? That had been a giveaway, and now, in spite of his secretiveness, she wanted to go on talking with him. She was enjoying every instant out here away from the, to her, wearisome callers. So she pretended that Pat was still interested in her presence and the Fays as a family. In America, she informed him, girls are much more independent than in Europe, even in the city, when mother goes away for a few days. Rosanna takes charge, orders the meals, and manages the servants, but 20 isn't so awfully young as all that, anyway. Pat, many girls are married and have babies before they are 20. Rosanna isn't likely to marry, though, and so she might as well have the pleasure of acting as though she is old enough to be married. Mightn't she? Staying an old maid doesn't mean being helpless and dependent in America, Pat. But Pat did not rise to her bait. He preferred to go on weeding in silence, asking no more questions. Of course, even if he had shown curiosity, Claire would not have satisfied it as to the reason for Rosanna's not being likely to marry. That would be letting him a little too far into family secrets. In fact, Claire would not have confided in anybody on this topic. It was a secret of hers and Rob's. Their father had told it to them, and Rosanna herself probably did not guess that they knew. But it was this: Rosanna had no use for proposals of marriage, although nobody could say they were lacking, because long ago she had fallen hopelessly in love with a sailor, who, on account of her youth, considered her merely a playmate. It happened on a sea voyage, which she had taken with her father to the South Seas, the winter she was 16. She had left school to go, and Claire hoped that something as wonderful as that would break into her own school year sometime. The captain and the officers and the sailors, and that one sailor in particular, all had been very jolly and friendly with Rosanna and Gerald Fay during the long voyage. It was then that Rosanna had learned to play craps and get simply miraculous music out of the cheapest, smallest mouth organ, and to whistle tunes that broke your heart or made you feel like marching. But in spite of these really remarkable accomplishments, which in themselves would only have made Rosanna more congenial with her brother and sister, when she returned from that trip she seemed suddenly a stranger. From that date she began to say, firmly and frequently, that she would never marry, and she gave as her reason, hiding the real one, that since their parents were artists, and so often went abroad to do portraits of kings and queens and prime ministers, she, Rosanna, must turn to and be mother and father to her younger brother and sister. Claire and Rob would exchange looks at that, but they kept from smiling. So Rosanna had moved farther and farther away from them into the world of quite grown up, with every step she took growing more remote, and at the same time they couldn't help noticing it, more beautiful. Claire would not have told Pat any of this, not she, but she would have thrown out hints and been mysterious if only he had encouraged her a little. She watched him weeding and lost patience. "Pat Donovan," she exclaimed, when she could stand his stupid silence not another minute. You needn't act so peeved just because I asked you a simple question. Everybody has to ask questions sometimes, and what's the use of getting insulted? You don't have to answer questions unless you want to, but it would be polite, at least to say you heard and were sorry not to be able to answer. For a person who is so full of manners as you are. Pat flared up. Claire, can't you see? Isn't it obvious? There's a reason I'm so secret. A good reason. And Miss Rosanna said I needn't tell. She said I could work for her and earn my wages, and that she'd respect my silence. She understands. She knows I'm not a thief, or a spy, or anything bad, but just a man who's got to show that he can earn his living and take a man's place in the world. It doesn't make any difference to her where I came from, whether from China or Africa. So, oh, all right, I'll let it alone, Pat. But anyway, you won't mind telling me why you went over into Tanglewood, will you? Didn't you see the signs? They're there because the place is rented this summer. The first time it has ever happened. It's dreadfully disappointing, and more than disappointing, sad. For years, even way back when we used to visit Granny, that big house was closed. We always played in the woods, and loved creeping around the house, and looking in at the windows. Under the drawing-room window, on the terrace, there are the most delicious violets, long-stemmed purple ones. There aren't violets like 'em anywhere else in the world. They are enchanted violets. There's something about them. Rosanna keeps that crystal bowl on the hall table, full as long as they last. And now this summer we only got one bunch, and the house is rented to just ordinary, everyday people who have those signs nailed up to keep us out. Their name is Titus. Pat was looking at Claire curiously. He asked, "How do you know they are just ordinary, everyday people, Claire? What makes you so sure? How do you know that they are not as mysterious as the house itself? For it is a mysterious house, enchanted or something, as the violets you said were." Claire edged toward Pat on her hands and knees. "So you have been over there, right up to the house, and you feel it too, how it's different from other closed houses, only it isn't closed now, it's inhabited. But it's still different, in spite of those Tituses. Tell me, Pat, did you actually see anything with your eyes?" "We did. The day we got here. We've never seen anything before, ourselves only suspected. The house was enchanted, haunted." "What did you see?" "Well, I didn't see anything. Not actually see." "What did you and Rob see?" But Claire realized that now they were going a little fast, speeding along. She slowed up. "Not if you laugh. I can't tell you what Rob and I saw, Pat, unless you will try to take in what a real mystery it was, and you must believe every word of it. Do you suppose you can believe, unless you think you can? I can't tell you. Most certainly it is understood. How could I not believe you if you tell me a thing seriously? You and Rob, I imagine, do not lie. I should like to know what you saw over there at that house. How long ago?" "Oh, about 3 weeks ago, before the Tituses came. The next day the signs got put up, and it was something that surprised you." Claire and Pat were sitting in the grass at the edge of the garden, facing each other now, and close enough to allow them to speak, with voices very much hushed. She gave him one long, penetrative look before she answered. He met it so satisfactorily, however, that she breathed a deep breath of contentment. Then she told him. Chapter 2. Mystery Appears. It was early afternoon when the Fays had arrived at Lark's Nest 3 weeks ago, and a very hot day for June. But in spite of the heat, Claire and Rob went off to explore Tanglewood, and to collect a big bunch of violets for Rosanna's crystal bowl in the hall, leaving their trunks and suitcases unopened. Summer would not really begin for them until they had been welcomed by Tanglewood and the deserted house. They kept a pact of silence in the woods, not speaking at all, and walking and running like Indians, with care not to startle even the birds. This was their way in all woods, but more particularly over there in Tanglewood, for Tanglewood, they had always felt, was haunted by something more than birds and beasts, something or somebody even shyer, infinitely more elusive. The last stretch of the way between Lark's Nest and Wing Gate was a beech wood, with the light poured along little aisles of shimmering fern, or green and silvery moss, and there were orange mushrooms springing with delicate unexpectedness, you might almost say unbelievableness, beneath their feet, and withdrawn into the shadows furtive clumps of ghostly Indian pipes stood cold and still. There was the flower, too, which Claire called False Lily of the Valley. It ran along beside them, but always a little way back from the paths their feet naturally took, safe and elusive. The bird songs there in that wood were just a shade different from the bird songs in most woods, airy, tentative, perhaps not quite certain. So they came to the back of the deserted house, and were glad to find it, as always, deserted, the windows closed against the woods. It was still theirs then. This summer was to be like the others, but not quite. Something was different. Rob saw it first and bent down sharply, pointing it out to Claire. It was a footprint, a yard or so from the trellis-enclosed back door, right at the edge of the woods. A footprint of any kind in this deserted place would have attracted their surprised attention. But this footprint was actually startling, because they saw at a glance that it was the footprint of a sandal. It was not the kind of sandal called barefoot, and sold in everyday shoe stores. Either it was a peculiar sandal, much more like the old Greek variety. There was the straight oblong from the sole of the foot, with no arc indicated, and plain as day in the wood loam, the print of the great toe. It must be a man's footprint, because it was so long. They searched all round for further evidences that somebody had been there before them, and very recently, but found none. There was just that one footprint, made by somebody walking out of the woods toward the house. The springy moss everywhere, abounding, allowed no hint of where the necessary other steps had fallen. So they gave it up and continued on their quest for violets, but they had their ceremonies for things. Claire and Rob, and now they did not immediately fall upon the violets, which they perceived at once were purpler, longer stemmed, and more plentiful than ever this year. Instead, they went up to the drawing room, French windows, picking their way carefully through the purple carpet. They stood close to one of the long window panes, curled the palms of their hands against the sides of their cheeks as screens against the afternoon light, and looked in at the furnished but forever death-still drawing room. At first it all seemed as usual, not a chair or a rug out of place. Wingate belonged to a one-time Massachusetts senator, a widower whose only child, a daughter, had died there. Since the day of the funeral, which had taken place in Boston, he had never returned to the house. Everything stood exactly as it stood the day the funeral party had left the house years ago. How many Claire did not know exactly. No one had come to dust or pull curtains or boards up the windows. But in spite of absolute neglect, the place had come to no harm. It was more than 5 miles from the village, well off any main roads, on a very poor and hilly dirt road which ended at its closed and locked iron gates, queer great wrought iron structures in the shape of huge wings, giving the place its name. There were no rowdies in that remoteness to turn the house into a rendezvous, and so far it had escaped the attention of tramps. The drawing room was the room Claire and Rob liked best. They knew it by heart, except the one corner which could not be seen, no matter how hard they crowded against the panes and turned their eyes sidewise. They could have told at once if any smallest, most unimportant bit of still life was out of place, but it never was. That was what the term still life meant to Claire and Rob when they heard artist use it. Their minds would fly to the objects grouped on the various tables and the mantel over the fireplace in Wingate's drawing room. Still life. All that drawing room was still life, waiting for a touch or a breath to wake it again and allow it to go on as it had been going when the death of that girl had halted it. But so far nothing had broken the charm of stillness that had been cast there. The only change was an increasing dimness that fell with increasing layers of silvery dust. Color and clarity drew back farther into the pictures and mirrors. Tables, chairs, all the things in the room withdrew deeper into themselves year by year. Claire always looked first for the little boy, Angel, a marble boy who stood with wings spread, his dimpled chubby feet tiptoeing on a pinkish marble cloud above and a bit to the left of the black-tiled fireplace. How the cloud was fastened to the wall you could not see from the window. It looked to Claire as though the cloud just stood out in the air of itself. Years ago, when she and Rob had first come to the window, the little boy's eyes had looked laughingly and sweetly into theirs. But as summers passed, and the veils of dust kept on falling, the laughter in the eyes grew still, and then they could not discern it any more at all. Today the eyes seemed closed down, shut, but of course it must be only the dust over them. A statue's eyes cannot go shut. An oblong mirror hung between two panels, of tapestry on the wall opposite the windows. The glass was set in a frame of large gilt roses. It reflected the window which Claire and Rob usually chose to look in at. They themselves stood in the mirror, dark children against the shining background of the world outside. 3 brown tree trunks stood there too, and farther back, green leaves of the bushes of an old garden border quivered in the sunlight. Green leaves and sprays of green leaves reflected in a mirror have a certain magic, especially when a light wind shakes them. Anybody knows that. For a few days in each summer, tall, big, incredibly flaming pot pies, springing where the violets had been, would hedge in the dark children in the mirror. The tapestries hanging on either side of the mirror never had come clear to Rob and Claire. They were dim from the very first, but interesting for all their dimness. They were like the clouds heaped up in the sky, or flames of an open fire. No 2 people would find the same pictures there, but there were always pictures of some sort, for eyes that wanted them and looked. The only thing that Claire was quite sure of was a little doe that lifted its head at the extreme top left corner of the tapestry on the right. That head she could always find in any light, in any season, but Rob would not grant her even that much certainty. The bit she pointed out to him, calling it the head of a doe, he thought was more likely the tip of the plume of a knight's helmet. The chairs in the room were covered with yellow damask. 1 chair stood near enough to the window for them to trace the elaborate pattern of leaves and roses woven into the texture. They were formal, straight chairs with high backs and heavy claw feet. The long damask curtains, which hung from poles and framed the window sashes, were made double, yellow on the outside, blue on the inside. The blue shone sky-like in the mirror. How fortunate it was that nobody had thought to draw those curtains as the funeral party was leaving the house. Not only would Claire and Rob have missed the room, but the room itself would have missed the sunshine, and it would never have kept at its heart, as it had now for years, that reflection of 3 tree trunks, shaking green leaves, sky, incredible red poppies, and sometimes 2 children, Rob and Claire, out in the light, gathering their huge bunches of violets, or standing up against the long window pane, turning into dark children, then by the light behind them. And today everything was as always. Even that book somebody years ago had left lying open on a footstool, a chunky, well-worn volume that somehow impressed Claire as the book that would have in it the magic she was always hoping and expecting to find in every new book she opened, and never did find quite, though sometimes very nearly. This book would have it. She wondered if it had delighted the girl who had put it down, open like that, and then died without finishing it, for she was sure it was hers, and the knitting was hers too, a bunch of dark wool on long ivory needles, tucked away in the corner of the big chair, nearest the window. It was something she had been making for her father, something dignified and dark to please him. A little table stood right up against the window strewn with knickknacks. There was a tiny golden kangaroo gambolling across a square of old lace, a jade Buddha, his profile to the window, a minute wax model of the temple at Jerusalem. These and other fascinating objects had remained immobile, safe through another winter. Claire's eyes, in swift examination of the drawing room, had come there last. She was about to whisper, "It's all right, Rob, let's get some violets now," when she started, or rather they both started at the identical instant. For it was not all right. Something had happened. Nothing had been moved in the room, but something had been added. At one edge of the square of lace, directly in front of the jade Buddha, lay a circle of brilliant light, a dazzling light, a piece of rainbow thrown down on the dusty table. They stared, hardly believing just at first. Then it came clear what it was, a diamond bracelet. They must be diamonds, real, not glass, nor any other material in the world, but the stuff of diamonds would ever give off such a blaze of light. As Claire and Rob concentrated on the amazing object, gradually they became aware of something else, and something that excited them even more. Not far from the Buddha, on the bare surface of the table, they saw the distinct print of a hand, all the fingers spread. It was almost as clearly marked there in the dust, as though it had been made on sooted paper purposely. It was a man's hand, because of the length, from wrist to fingertips, but it was peculiarly slender, and the fingers were astonishingly conical at the tips. Claire started to whisper, but again she was startled into silence. From the room came a sound. 2, 3, 4 beautiful chords were struck from a piano. So, somebody was in the room. It was deserted no longer, and they knew something more, something they had always wanted to know, that the one corner of the room, not visible from the window, held a piano. After a swift exchange of glances, they stood, frozen with fascination, looking harder than ever into the room. But at the fourth chord the music stopped. Had the player become aware of themselves in the mirror? They did not move because they could not. Fascination held them, and then they saw him, silently. From that part of the room, forever invisible, came a figure, a man. He walked toward the table of the knickknacks, his eyes on the bracelet as he came. Almost within touching distance of the jewels, he lifted his gaze and encountered theirs. Chapter 3. Keep Out. So his was the foot that had made the mark at the edge of the woods. He was a man, very tall, and seeming even taller because of the white turban wound around his head. From head to foot he was dressed in flowing white. His features were aquiline, like the features of some old Egyptian king, and the gaze which returned theirs was keen, dark, piercing in the extreme. He kept one hand behind his back, and it flashed into both Claire's and Rob's minds simultaneously that the hidden hand might very well be clutching a scimitar. As long as he stood and looked at them in that piercing way, Claire and Rob did not move a muscle, because they could not. His eyes held theirs as claws hold objects. Even at that distance, and through the window pane, yes. But after a minute, he turned his head ever so slightly and glanced beyond them out onto the terrace, as though to see whether they were alone. They took advantage of the instant to draw back, but each step that they took in withdrawal required a strange effort on their part. It was exactly as though they had to drag up feet which had actually struck roots into the ground. That sensation sometimes comes in nightmares, but seldom in waking life. Once away from the window, however, and out on the terrace, they came to themselves. They even turned and looked back toward the window. It was blank, as it had been when they had come. The white figure had withdrawn, but they did not loiter or bother about the violets. Even so, by common consent, they moved on toward the front of Wing Gate, the quickest way to get out of sight of the French windows. But they did not run. They even pretended not to be in any particular hurry. Once well around the corner, standing close together on the fern-grown driveway, they spoke for the first time. "Woo!" ejaculated Rob. "What is a Hindu doing in there? And why did he glare at us like that?" Claire looked up at the house. She said, "See, Rob, it's all closed here too. There's not a window open. It must be awfully hot inside. I wonder." Then after a moment of silence, either Rob or Claire murmured, "Do you suppose it was real? Did we see him?" They decided that they had. And besides, there was the footprint at the edge of the woods. They need only go back and take a look at that to reassure themselves of the reality of the rest: the diamond bracelet, the music, the hand marked in the dust, and the king-like Hindu with the scimitar. Only, of course, they did not claim to be certain of the scimitar. "I'm going to try the front door," Rob said, finally. "If he is in there, I don't believe he has a right to be. If he belonged, or were a friend of Senator Lovell's, or had any real business there, wouldn't he have the windows open? And would he have just glared at us that way? Wouldn't he have spoken? I think so. But we didn't speak. Why should he? We were too surprised to speak. Besides, it was up to him." "I don't think so. He must have been as surprised as we were. How would we feel if we found two people staring into Lark's Nest, as we were staring in there? We wouldn't like it. But Lark's Nest is our own home. Nobody have a right. Perhaps he has rented Wing Gate and shut himself in like that, with no air, all the windows down, on this scorching day. Not likely." Claire too thought it not very likely. She went in out of the hot sunshine, under the cool portico, with Rob while he tried the door. Every summer, it might as well be admitted, Rob and Claire had tried this door, and the other doors of the house, and the windows. But although curtains had been left undrawn, the doors and windows were all securely bolted. That much the grief-bemazed servants had seen too, and the great front door today was still firm. "So he has locked himself in," Rob exclaimed softly. "If he's just looking over the house, or has rented it, or has any legitimate business in there whatever, why would he lock the door like that in the middle of the afternoon? It's darned queer." It was terribly queer. "How shall we go home now?" Claire asked. "By the road." The road would be a good mile longer than the short-cut through the woods, but somehow to Claire it seemed rather desirable just then. "Not on your life. We'll go the way we always do. What's more, I'm going back and look in that window again. We've got as much right to look in as he has to look out." "Why, Claire, it's ours. Or, oh well, it's almost ours. He'd better not touch anything. If he does, we'll telegraph Senator Lovell. Somebody in the village must have his address." "All right, Rob. Miss Ford will have his address at the post office. But let's go around the other side of the house and not look into the drawing room again. There was something fierce about that Hindu." "Well, if you say so, we can come back tomorrow and see how things are." On the other side of Wing Gate, too, the windows and the one door were shut tight. They even pushed at one or two of the windows, swiftly, in passing, and found them, as always, fast. And they caught no glimpse of a white-robed figure in any of the rooms as they hurried by, whether furniture had been moved about or disturbed in any way. They did not halt to ascertain. Rob, as well as Claire, was more than a little uneasy. They cast only hasty glances at the footprint in the wood loam, near the back door this time. Rob merely said, under his breath, as they sped on, "Oh, he's real, all right. Our imagination, even yours and mine. Claire doesn't make footprints." Rosanna was disappointed when they returned without the violets, but that was forgotten at once when they recounted what they had seen and heard of strangeness. "We'll all go over tomorrow," she stated, "and have another look. If he's come to live there, and has any right at all, he'll have things airing by then. We can quickly tell. Now we've got to pitch into these trunks, and Hester can't get the stove to going. Rob, you'll have to tinker with it." Next morning, soon after breakfast, the three of them climbed the wall and started through Tanglewood. But before they reached the Beeches, they met Mr. Ford, the postmistress's husband. It was the first time they had ever encountered anybody in their enchanted wood, but they were more surprised by Mr. Ford's occupation than by his presence there. He was hammering a sign onto a tree trunk. It read, "Keep out, no trespassing allowed." So that was it. The place was rented. Their wood was theirs. Really, no longer. Everything now could be explained. But not at all. After they had talked with Mr. Ford, they realized that nothing was explained. There was the sorry fact that Wing Gate was indeed rented, but not to a Hindu. It had been taken for the summer by a man named Titus, who would be coming to occupy it in a week or so. Meanwhile, these notices had come to Miss Ford by express, with directions from Mr. Titus to have somebody see that they were well placed, at suitable intervals, through the whole estate. Before he had begun work this morning, Mr. Ford had taken the precaution to look around the house a bit. It was certainly a surprising thing that so many valuable objects as the deserted house seemed to contain, had stood there all these years, plain for the eyes of anybody who took the pains to look, and nobody had broken in to steal. He supposed it was because Wingate stood so far away from everything. Why, he himself had never had the curiosity to wander up that way. He hadn't known the curtains were up and the windows unboarded. If he had thought anything about it, which he had not, he would have supposed the house was properly boarded up and closed. Nobody ever comes. I don't believe anybody knows about it at all except us, Claire said wistfully. Rosanna began to ask Mr. Ford about the Hindu. Had he seen a strange man anywhere around Wingate when he made his recent examination of the deserted house? No, certainly he hadn't. Why should he? He looked at them surprised. Has there been a Hindu in the village? Was there one there yesterday? A man in a turban, a very dark-skinned stranger. A Hindu? Not that Mr. Ford knew of, and he guessed he'd know if there was. Leastwise, Miss Ford would know. Pretty funny if she wouldn't. No, never in the history of the village had there been a Hindu in these parts. Hardly any foreigners at all. Not at Crescent Lake, neither, and certainly not yesterday. Rosanna began to look at Claire and Rob, a little doubtfully. Well, I'm going home and help Hester get up the parlor curtains, she said. It's frightfully hot. I don't believe you'll find much excitement at Wingate now. Mr. Ford ought to know. Mr. Ford drew himself up at the compliment and smiled at Rosanna. Perhaps his first smile of that summer. But then there was nobody in the world who wouldn't smile into Rosanna's eyes. She had a way with people. It was too bad about Rosanna, though. She was wonderful. But if she had a little more insight into the within of things, she would be just that much more wonderful. Only she hadn't. Imagine her thinking that Mr. Ford would know, merely because he had nosed around a place, anything much about that place. Claire and Rob were not so simple as that. We'll go on, Rob said. This Titus can't mind, since he hasn't come yet. Mr. Ford had caught the exchange of glances between Claire and Rob. He said in a tone he would never use to Rosanna, "Go if you like, but it's the last time. I'm sheriff, you know, kids, and the law's the law. These signs mean what they say. Keep out. After this, remember, I'm telling you." If he didn't have such a nice wife, I'd hate that man, Claire muttered as she and Rob moved away together toward Wingate. Their hearts were sore. Was this really their last time? Had they lost Tanglewood, and the boy Angel, and all the rest? It looked like it. When they came to the edge of the beeches, they were relieved to find that the footprint was still there. That was one thing, anyway, that Mr. Ford had missed in his nosing, but who would expect him not to? A man who could enjoy hammering placards onto the opal-like trunks of serene trees, and never feel a pang. Anyone who could do that, ugh! They went straight to the drawing-room windows. The bracelet was gone, but the print of the hand in the dust remained. Today, their point of view had changed. They wanted the Hindu back. They did not feel him an interloper any longer. He was better anyway than those ugly signs getting hammered up in the woods. Even here, half a mile away, the hammer strokes were audible through the still air. The Hindu had been, at least, silent, or rather, the only sounds he made were musical. They remembered, almost as though they were, hearing them at this instant, the 4 melodious chords that had come from the invisible piano. If they had only remembered those chords when the Hindu stood glaring at them, his glare never could have frightened them. Anyway, now they had no dread of the apparition-like figure. They could see for themselves that he had done no harm to their room. His had been so undisturbing a presence that even the little boy angel had not opened his eyes to look. Rob, his mouth against the pane, began calling, softly at first, but as no response came from within, louder. "Hello, hello, in there. Are you in there?" It was no good. Nobody moved from the invisible corner into view. So this time, Claire and Rob gathered their violets. It was the biggest bunch they had ever got, and Claire carried them home in her lifted skirt. They made a wide circle through the woods as they went to avoid Mr. Ford and his hammer strokes, and since that day they had never once gone back, because Rosanna was a very law-abiding person, and she was, after all, their sort of mother. So what do you think, Pat, now? Aren't things around here rather mysterious and exciting? The weeding had not prospered, although an hour had passed since Claire had begun her tale of wonder. Pat had followed all her revelations with deep interest, his eyes most of the time on her eager face. Claire was distinctly elfin, her pointed chin, her dark eyes set wide apart, her brown hair a mass of ringlets that lifted with the lightest movement of air, and seemed unreal in their lightness and the perfection of their spirals. She looked more like an etching than a person, Pat thought, but in spite of that, she was real enough, more real and alive, perhaps, than anybody he had ever known. He was thinking this, and so she had to ask. Again, aren't things around here rather mysterious and exciting? He had to agree that they were, very, but he added, "What about your party, Claire? Do you suppose it's still going on?" "Oh, bother the party. Who cares? But, I bet it's time to go in to say goodbye to 'em. Look at the sun. It's after 5. That sure. I don't mind saying goodbye. That sort of stuff is soon over. But, Pat, tell me, aren't you a little thrilled by the Hindu?" She was standing up, smoothing down her crumpled, grass-stained skirt. Pat stood up with her, as though they themselves might be in a drawing-room, at a party. His manners were magnificent. All the Fays had noticed and commented on that from the first. It was because of Pat's good manners that she stayed a minute longer, tempted to tease him before returning to the party. But perhaps you can't be so thrilled as Rob and me, after all, because you yourself are a walking mystery, Pat. You're every bit as mysterious as the Hindu, of course. It's only that you aren't so mysterious looking. Claire, he said very earnestly, couldn't you leave all that alone about me? Rosanna doesn't mind. Why should you? Claire laughed. Low, rather thrilled laughter. I don't mind. I like it. Just the way I like the Hindu. Only, Pat, you're never to talk to anybody but just us Fays and Hester about all I've told you. And I won't talk about you of course. I never meant to. Suppose I did tell Miss Ford next time I go for the mail. It would probably end you as a mystery anyway. She knows everything about everybody for miles and miles around, except our Hindu. She doesn't know about him, so there's a tiny chance she wouldn't know about you. Anyway, I'm not going to her for information on the subject of our strange hired boy. Pat stood, quiet and thoughtful. He was a stocky boy, broad of brow and broad of shoulder, a strong contrast to Claire's slim elfishness. He was like a being soaked in sunshine. This was not the first time Claire had thought it. He might be one of the stater of the Greek gods. Which one, she hardly knew. Perhaps an unrecorded one, an obscure but very nice one, a rather young god, of course. He held out his hand. Let's shake hands. He begged seriously. Or you're not talking about me to that postmistress, or to anybody. Could you do that, Claire? She gave her hand quickly. As Pat took it, he said surprisingly, I think you are a very sweet girl, and I am glad you are not an etching. One thing that hand clasp exposed was this. Claire's slim hand, with its pointed fingers, was an even brown in color, and spoke of manual labor, but the broad hand, with the squarish-tipped fingers, which gripped so strongly, was pale, where the garden soil did not conceal the fact, and smooth as silk. Chapter 4. In Silver Slippers. Claire did not go directly to the parlor, but paused by the side table in the dining room to eat one of the sandwiches from a plate that had been put down there. As she munched, she became aware, from the sudden crescendo of the babble and the sounds of chairs being pushed about, that the party was breaking up. If she hurried, she might have just time to finish her sandwich before the hall was flooded and the goodbyes began. The first guest to come out of the parlor was Violet Janice. She moved in a straight line to the mirror in the corner of the hall, well within view of the spot in the dining room where Claire stood. But she did not see Claire, because she was so intent on the vision of herself. She had come to powder her nose, straighten her tight small hat, and finally set a brave touch of lipstick to her already brilliant lips. Violet was only a year or two older than Claire, but that year or two seemed to make all the difference. She had attached herself to Rosanna's older crowd, and lately she had been trying to drag Rob into that adult society. For Rob, because of his height and something dignified and serious in his dark face, impressed people as being older than he was. It never entered Claire's head to sing out to Violet that she was there in the dining room. In the first place, she considered Violet in quite another world from her own. An ant does not ask for the attention of a squirrel, does it? Well, Claire had the ant's pure indifference to another race of beings. In the second place, her mouth was too full. It was still too full when Rob appeared at Violet's shoulder. Violet looked at him in the glass, a dimple in her right cheek, fairly sparkling, but what she said did not sound, not to Claire anyway, particularly friendly. "Hello there. So you deign to draw near at last. However you and Rosanna can stand this bird's nest existence of yours is beyond me. Why don't you sell out here and buy that absolutely adorable rose lawn cottage at the edge of our shore front? They're offering it for a song now, Father says. Then you'd be in things." Rob kept his grave look. "You see, we like Lark's Nest," he told her, "and we are in things enough." Violet tossed her head ever so little. "But you aren't. You don't know what good times we have. Come over tomorrow, will you? Come right after lunch, and we'll have a tennis set." "Tomorrow is Sunday," Rob reminded her, "and besides, Claire and I—" "Oh, Claire. Well, bring Claire then, if you can't move without the nursling. She can play with the children on the beach." "Ha!" The "ha" came from the dining room. Claire had no thought of restraining the expression of her wrath. It burst forth muffled, but definite, through a large mouthful of cheese dream. Violet whirled around toward the dining room door, while Rob turned more slowly. "Ha yourself. So there you are, listening and peeping as usual, little one. If I had a little sister like you, I'd positively make her wear a bell." Rob smiled, his slow, rare smile. "Oh, Claire's all right," he said casually. "We don't either of us have to wear bells. We managed to keep pretty close together without that." Violet looked puzzled for an instant, and by the time she had sorted out the meaning of the slow, smiling words, the party had definitely broken up. In a rush, the little hall was flooded with people. Claire hastily removed the remains of the delectable cheese dream from her lips with a handkerchief which she fortunately found in her pocket, and went out to be polite. Her mouth was impeccable, but she was conscious of Violet's haughty gaze, concentrated on the earthy smirches decorating her white silk stockings. She didn't care much, though, and she stood as close to Rob as she could while she said her goodbye to the people drifting past and out, exactly as Rosanna expected her to say it. Violet and her brother Bill were the last to leave. They stood out on the step waiting for Rosanna, whom Bill had persuaded to go down to the state road to see the new car they had parked there. Rosanna had dashed into the coat closet for her shade hat. Claire and Rob were still together by the mirror. Then it happened. The Dryad arrived in their midst. She came walking down the steep, narrow flight of stairs which led up to the bedrooms. Rosanna, emerging from the coat closet, stopped dead and stared at her Violet and Bill opened the screen door again and looked with all their eyes and all their curiosity. Claire and Rob, not so unaccustomed to amazements as these people of the more adult world, nevertheless seized hands and stayed enraptured, looking at no one, or at least just allowing her glance to brush them all like butterfly wings. The Dryad came on down, hesitated for one delicate second on the bottom stair, and then swiftly moved toward the parlor door, went in, and closed it after her. Rosanna started, as though from a dream, and went to join Bill and Violet, motioning Claire and Rob toward the parlor door as she departed. But Claire could not move. She sank down on a convenient chair, leaving Rob to go on obediently into the parlor. He too closed the door after him, and there he was, shut in with a Dryad. Claire thought that anybody would have spotted that girl for a Dryad. She had looked to be a little older than Claire herself, about Rob's age. Her frock was a silvery gray, like the undersides of the leaves of a silver maple when a rainstorm is coming. There was something unearthly about her pearly face, so extremely pale, with its gray eyes thick-lashed, and so fluttering of gaze. The eyes had been wide open and questioning as they brushed past Claire's, exactly as the eyes of a Dryad among mortals ought to look when in contact with rude human stares. Her hair was as beautiful as her eyes, inky soft and inky black, and curved over her head, just touching her cheeks and concealing her ears like a wave on the verge of breaking. No sound of voices was coming through the closed parlor door. Claire at last went to that door and stood close to make sure they were not talking, but it was a fact. All was as still as night in there. Who would have thought that Claire, once given a chance to meet a fairy, would have stayed outside the door? She did not understand herself why she was acting this way. Suddenly she turned and fled to the lane, the sunshine, and Rosanna. Rosanna was halfway back up the lane when Claire catapulted through the screen door. "Well, Claire," she called, "who is the princess? Or was I dreaming?" "You weren't dreaming," Claire assured her, running to Rosanna and seizing her hand. "Only she isn't a princess. She's a Dryad. Rob is entertaining her. Do Dryads drink lemonade?" "Wake up, Claire. What was the girl doing, coming down from upstairs like that? How'd she get there? Who is she? Why didn't you stay and ask her yourself?" "I don't know why I didn't. I was quite stunned, I guess, and somehow I thought it would be fun just to keep her to ourselves. Violet and Bill were sure I was joking when I said I had no idea who the vision was. What has she to say for herself, going upstairs like that, all on her own, and a stranger? Rob's asking her, I suppose. I didn't go in, but I've figured it out that she's a Dryad who got driven out of Tanglewood by the no trespassing signs. It may have happened a day Mr. Ford put 'em up, and she's been hiding in our attic ever since. She smelled the cheese dreams, and was so starved she had to come down. Or don't Dryads eat cheese dreams?" Rosanna did not bother to answer, for they had reached the front door. Together they took a long breath and went on into the parlor. The Dryad was sitting in a corner of the sofa near the window, sipping at one of the green goblets of lemonade. Rob had attended to that, but he had not remembered to pass the sandwiches. He was standing awkwardly over near the bookcases, appearing slightly bewildered. It looked as if neither of them had said a word. Rosanna visibly pulled herself together and seized control of the situation. "Good afternoon," she said in her clear social voice. "I'm glad you've come, but I haven't an idea who you are, you know." The Dryad put down her glass and stood up. "Don't you really know who I am?" she asked in a hushed tone. "Haven't you an idea? Haven't any of you an idea?" The three fays exchanged baffled looks. With one accord they shook their bemazed heads. But Rob was the one who answered, in a rushing, breathless sort of way. "We want to have an idea, though," he said. "Tell us." The Dryad sank back to the sofa, deep into one corner, and for a minute hid her eyes behind her fingers. When she looked up again, her face was more unearthly pale than ever, and her eyes had gone inky, like her hair. She murmured, "I thought one of you might know. I thought you would tell me." Rosanna was the first to see the glimmer. "You mean that you yourself don't know who you are?" she asked. "Is that it?" "Yes, that is it. I was in some woods. That is as far back as I remember. The first thing I saw was an orange mushroom, a tiny one, right under my feet. I just barely saved myself from stepping on it. Then I heard a hermit thrush. You see, I know perfectly well what a hermit thrush is, and a mushroom, but I don't know what I am myself. It's dreadful." There was a hush over the parlor. The Dryad was right. Claire thought it would be rather dreadful not to know who you were, not to be aware even that you were a Dryad. The hushed voice went on. "Soon I came to a wall quite high. A little way to the right there was a break in it, a tumbled-down place. I went through. I saw the fields, then, and the orchards, but they didn't remind me of who I was or make me remember anything. Then I saw this house, like a little brown bird's nest among the flowers. I thought I might belong here, so I came on. I was ashamed to come up to the door, not knowing who I was, or whether I did really belong. But I came all the same. It wasn't until after I had rung the bell that I heard all those voices in here and realized that there was a tea party going on. You see, I know about tea parties too. Then it came to me that if I could only get up those stairs, which I saw through the screen door, and find a mirror somewhere, and look at my face in it, that ought to remind me, make me remember myself. Nobody came to answer the ring, and I was glad. After a minute, I just opened the door and stole upstairs. I went into the ship room, the one with the pictures of the sailing ships, and the ship models, and the wallpaper all sails and blowing clouds. If I had ever seen such a room before, wouldn't I remember it? I thought so. I looked for the mirror." "You were in Rosanna's room," Claire interrupted. "Nobody ever had such a room in the world before. You sort of feel as though you are sailing along in it, don't you?" "I did. That's just what I felt. The Dryad looked at Claire gratefully. Claire's low voice had sounded so understanding and helpful. Then I saw the mirror. Ugh! I put my hands over my eyes, but soon I had to look. I went right up close and opened my eyes, and I didn't know myself. I never had seen that girl before, so I came down. I had heard the callers going away, and thought I should avoid everybody but the hostess. But when I got halfway down the stairs, I saw that the hall was not empty after all. There were 3 people in it, as well as those 2 at the door. I didn't know anything else to do, but come right on down and go into the parlor to find the hostess. I knew I had to explain to somebody after breaking into a house like that, and going upstairs and everything. The parlor was empty. Then you, the Dryad, just touched Rob with her fleeting butterfly glance, came in and gave me a drink. I was very thirsty, that's all I know. Rosanna asked thoughtfully, "And you are absolutely certain that the only thing you remember is the woods? Wasn't there anything at all before that?" Claire laughed, her thrilled laugh. "Why, Rosanna," she interposed, "don't be stupid. It's as plain as pickles. The woods are all she would remember, being what she is, being what I am. So you do know, the Dryad's eyes were elusive no longer. They were devouring Claire's, but it was Rosanna who answered, and her voice was as sharp as it ever could be. 'Be quiet, Claire,' she commanded, and then turning to the Dryad, 'No, my sister has no more idea who you are than we have.' She was indulging in a private flight of imagination, that's all. But this is no time for such nonsense. It's too serious. So the woods are absolutely the only thing you remember?" "Oh, yes. There's nothing else at all before that. Can you understand how strange that makes one feel?" "A little, yes," Rosanna responded. "Sometimes when I myself have waked up in a strange place after a deep sleep, I have had that experience, not been able to remember who I was or where I was. It lasts only an instant, though, that kind of forgetting. Your sensation must be like that, only drawn out much longer. It's horrid, I know, but don't be frightened, please." She was sitting beside the Dryad, and now she took her hand in one of her own, and put her other hand lightly down over it. "There are ways of recovering a lost memory. A little patience, and we'll hit upon a way of jogging up yours." Claire and Rob knew Rosanna's resourcefulness, and they hadn't a doubt now that she would find a way for the Dryad out of her predicament. And the Dryad herself, although she hadn't the brothers and sisters' past experiences to go on, accepted Rosanna's assurances at their face value, looking at her with utter gratitude shining from her eyes. "First, let's see the thing reasonably," Rosanna began, sitting very erect and releasing the Dryad's hand. Rosanna wasn't the hand-holding sort, and her recent demonstrativeness had been a little surprising, and indicated how really moved she was by the girl's plight. "You are much too fresh, sort of rain-washed, you know, to have got here from any great distance, by train or auto or walking. Your hair is in perfect order, your clothes too. Your slippers are scratched and a little stained. They were silver slippers with low heels and tied at the ankles with silver ribbon. But that could have happened just coming through the fields. Such fragile things. Are you tired? Do you feel as though you had been walking far?" The Dryad gave this her thought. "No," she answered after a pause. "I don't feel as though I had walked far exactly, but I am very, extraordinarily tired. I feel weak as water." Again they noticed, this time with some shock and more pity, how deathly pale the Dryad was. Rosanna sprang to her feet. "How silly we are!" she exclaimed. "It doesn't matter who you are now. What does matter is that you are nearly dead from fatigue, and perhaps hungry too. Claire, run and beat her up an eggnog, your very best. I'm going to put you to bed, my dear. When you've eaten and slept, then will be the time to rack our brains over the rest. Come along."